Welcome back to these lectures on History 2111. This is lecture 14. We're going to look at or begin talking about the origins of the American Revolution. I'm going to go through these long and short-term causes for you, try to give you some idea of why each is significant. I want to start with some intellectual causes of the Revolution, and we can begin with John Locke. Locke, English philosopher, whose writings have an impact on politics in the late 1800s, or rather the late 18th century. John Locke made a couple of arguments that I want to bring up. First is his attack on the divine right of kings. The notion that God has sanctioned a king's rule had predominated throughout Europe for some time. And of course, if God sanctions the king's rule, then it is not our business to question it or to replace that king. Locke attacked this notion and said that the king was not a religious position, that it was a political position, and in fact, a bad king should be replaced by his people. So this is a attack at the very foundation of royal power. Locke also made the argument about natural rights, life, liberty, and property. Locke made the argument that these rights come with you at birth. They are not bestowed upon you by a king. You'll notice this phrase, life, liberty, and property, probably sounds familiar. Thomas Jefferson would take this phrase and tweak it in our Declaration of Independence and call it life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He did this because he saw there was no need to divide Americans on the issue of property, since everyone does not own property. Everyone does have the right to pursue happiness, however. So you can see Jefferson using Locke here. Other long-term causes or intellectual causes, English common law. English common law, of course, has made its way across the Atlantic. The English colonists in North America assumed that common law applied to them as well as it did to Englishmen back in England. And they began to fear that indeed it did not apply to them. They began to fear and become hostile to the notion that they were not afforded all the rights and privileges of Englishmen. They were becoming less subjects of the crown and more slaves of the crown. At least this is the spin that the Sons of Liberty would put on this. So this is a long-term intellectual, psychological cause. Another long-term cause of the Revolution would be the fundamental difference in English society compared to the English colonists in the New World. In the New World, there's a great deal more a sense of egalitarianism, a sense of equality than there would be back in England, where society is rather strictly structured in hierarchies. In the New World, of course, there's an endless availability of land once the Indians are removed. And there's a sense that each man is capable of rising to great heights. This, of course, goes back to American exceptionalism and the arguments that Alexis de Tocqueville made about how Americans are so different from Europeans, believing that they are as good as anyone else. So there's a distinct difference in how the societies are structured. Another long-term cause, religious diversity in the New World is much greater than it is back in England. You have colonies devoted to particular religious factions. Maryland is created as a colony for Catholics. You may remember Pennsylvania, where the Quakers ventured, the Puritans in New England, the Church of England, the Anglicans down in Virginia, just a wide variety of religious persuasions, which makes the colonies much different than the mother country. Another long-term cause would be the result of the French and Indian War. French and Indian War ended in 1763. In Europe, it's called the 7 Years' War. In North America, we call it the French and Indian War. Here we have the British and their Indian allies fighting the French and their Indian allies. As a result of this war and France's defeat, England takes over New France, the New France that we talked about a few lectures ago. New France becomes Canada, and the English and the French, as a result of this long, expensive war, and I should emphasize that this war takes place in places other than North America. It's fought in Europe, in Asia, and Africa. So I heard one historian describe the French and Indian War as the First World War. So it is fought over a huge expanse of territory. Now, one of the results here, and this is fundamental to the Revolution, is that both the English and the French were strained financially by the French and Indian War. Both the English and the French governments will attempt to make up this financial shortfall by taxing its citizens. The English will begin taxing the colonists in the New World to help pay for the war that the British Parliament believed they had fought for the colonists. It seems only fair that the colonists should pitch in and help pay for this effort. Of course, the same thing is going to happen in France. If you wanted to point to both the American and French revolutions and their ultimate causes, you can start here with the financial difficulties encountered by both kingdoms following the French and Indian War, as both the French and the British attempt to tax their way out of this financial difficulty. In the United States, at the end of the French and Indian War, in North America or in the English colonies, the United States don't exist yet, the British attempted to keep her colonists east of the Appalachian Mountains, to keep the English colonists on the Atlantic seaboard. And they established what was called the Proclamation Line, which ran down the crest of the Appalachian Mountains, theoretically blocking the English colonists' attempt to go west of the Appalachians and to settle and colonize the Ohio Valley. The purpose of this, of course, was to keep the English colonists separate from the Indians who had been pushed west of the mountains. So the English here are trying, or Parliament is trying, to keep her colonists and the Indians separated so that the warfare will cease and that we can, or that the English colonists can develop economically without constant warfare with the Indians. Now, the colonists, of course, resent this, or at least some of them do. Some of the colonists, I can think of one in particular, George Washington in Virginia, has already surveyed and picked out land west of the mountains that he intends to occupy and to purchase. So many of the colonists feel as though their freedom to move westward is inhibited by the mother country, and this causes tension, tension that will boil over in the 1760s. Let's talk about some of the taxes that the English Parliament imposed upon the English colonists. Early taxes in 1763, at the end of the French and Indian War. It's no accident. The Sugar, or the Revenue Act, is passed. Colonial customs agents are assigned as tax collectors. There's a tax on molasses. This angers many of the colonists. In 1765, the infamous Stamp Act, whereby anything purchased or anything using paper requires a notary stamp. Legal documents, newspapers, playing cards, virtually anything having to do with paper requires a royal stamp, and people are angered by this. You see the Townsend duties, a tax on so-called luxury items, whether it's paint or glass, tea, paper. Again, the British Parliament is simply trying to raise money and is seeking a tax that will allow them to do that, that will not anger the colonists. Yet all of these taxes do anger the colonists. There emerges here from these efforts to tax the colonists a political group in Boston called the Sons of Liberty. These Sons of Liberty will begin to protest taxation without representation, something you probably heard in high school. In fact, they would paint broadsides on buildings, no taxation without representation. Another slogan popularized by the Sons of Liberty: are we English slaves or English subjects? Again, this referring back to the idea of the rights and privileges attendant to all Englishmen being denied to the English colonists in the New World. And I think you could easily say that Sons of Liberty, the emergence of this political group, is another long-term cause of the American Revolution. The Sons of Liberty helped organize what's called the non-importation movement. This movement's important for a couple of reasons. One, it tends to unite the colonists in common cause across class lines. This is something that every colonist can participate in. What it is a boycott of English imports. It's financial warfare, to put it plainly. The non-importation movement has other significances. For one thing, it encourages domestic manufacturing. If we are not going to import these items from England, we're going to have to make them ourselves here at home. So this is a spur to domestic manufacturing. Another significance of the non-importation movement is that it politicizes the household. If we're going to make this non-importation movement work, we're going to have to convince our wives and mothers to participate in it and to restrict their consumption to domestically made items, or items at least that are not imported from England. So you'll see here one of the results is that women begin to make their purchasing decisions based on the origin of those items, those trade items. This politicizes the household. We're buying stuff based on politics rather than their utility or their price. This also allows women to participate somewhat in the public sphere, the sphere of masculine commerce and politics. And of course, if we're not going to import British cloth, we're going to have to make it here in the colonies. So you see the emergence of these spinning bees, where the women have their spinning jennies and they have contests and social get-togethers in an effort to produce cloth to clothe the American colonist. Again, we're not going to import these items, so we have to produce them ourselves. The Sons of Liberty were behind this endeavor, again, constantly campaigning against British tyranny. You see you've probably seen the old flag of the coiled serpent with the headline, "Don't tread on me," and you see the English boot above the serpent. If the English attempt to snap out our liberties or to impose tyranny on the colonists, the English are going to get a sharp bite from this serpent. So this is a good start for our discussion of the origins of the American Revolution. In the next segment, we'll talk about the more immediate, short-term origins of the Revolution. Thank you.